The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt looked absolutely unstoppable on paper when it arrived in England during early 1943. This beast packed 8 50 caliber machine guns, could take punishment that would shred other fighters, and had a supercharged engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. American pilots climbing into those massive cockpits for the first time felt invincible. They were about to learn a brutal lesson that nearly cost the 8th Air Force its entire fighter escort capability. On April 15, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission over occupied Europe. Within 20 minutes of crossing the Dutch coast, they encountered Focke-Wulf 190s. What happened next shocked everyone involved. The German fighters turned inside the P-47s like they were standing still. American pilots yanked back on their control columns, trying to follow their enemies, turning fights the way every fighter pilot had done since World War I. The Thunderbolts wallowed through the air, bleeding speed with every turn. Luftwaffe pilots carved them apart. 4 P-47s went down that day without scoring a single kill. The problem wasn't pilot skill or courage. These American aviators had trained extensively, understood aerial combat theory, and wanted desperately to prove their aircraft. But they were flying the P-47 like it was a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt, nimble fighters that succeeded through maneuverability. The Thunderbolt weighed 12,500 LEBs empty. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it pushed past 17,500 LEBs. Its size and weight made it ill-suited for dogfighting in tight turns, and the pilots' attempts to apply traditional tactics nearly cost them their lives. Yet within this failure lay the seed of a new approach. The P-47 was not meant to outturn the Luftwaffe. It was meant to crush them with speed, firepower, and sheer durability. American pilots would soon discover a tactic that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths, turning what seemed like a disastrous first mission into a harbinger of air domination over Europe. After the disastrous first mission, the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group returned to base, shaken, but determined. The realization hit hard. Their beloved P-47 Thunderbolt, as powerful and rugged as it was, could not compete in traditional dogfights. Against the nimble Luftwaffe fighters, if flown like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt, every pilot knew instinctively that a change in approach was necessary. In the briefing room, the air was thick with tension. Maps of occupied Europe littered the tables, detailing every airfield, enemy patrol route, and known flak site. Officers emphasized caution, but also encouraged creativity. The P-47's massive airframe, once seen as a liability, now needed to be seen as a weapon in its own right. It could absorb hits that would shred other planes, dive at incredible speed, and unleash a devastating volume of fire. The question was how to leverage these strengths against more agile opponents. Training intensified. Pilots spent hours studying dive angles, throttle management, and energy retention. They were taught to avoid tight turns at low speed, and instead use boom and zoom tactics. Diving from high altitude with full throttle, firing on enemy formations, and then using the P-47's weight and power to climb back to safety. It was a radical departure from the dogfighting manuals they had memorized, but it was the only way to survive and dominate. Aircraft mechanics worked tirelessly to ensure every Thunderbolt was optimized. Engines roared on the tarmac as ground. Crews checked every component, from superchargers to ammunition belts. Pilots studied the sound and vibration of their engines so intimately that they could detect a malfunction mid-flight. These preparations were as crucial as the tactics themselves. Every mission demanded complete trust between pilot and machine. As the sun rose on April 22, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group took to the skies again. The European landscape stretched out below. Patchwork fields, rivers glinting in the morning light, and the ominous shadows of enemy airfields. The pilots felt the weight of their responsibility, not just to protect bombers, but to learn the lessons of combat in real time. Their first encounters were tentative. The Luftwaffe fighters were still fast, still deadly, but the P-47s were no longer attempting to outturn them. Instead, they stayed high, diving with calculated precision. A single P-47 could attack multiple enemies in one pass, using speed and firepower to disrupt formations. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate. And here's where we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments below. By the end of the day, the results were undeniable. P-47 pilots scored multiple kills without losing a single aircraft. The same machines that had been nearly helpless just a week earlier now ruled the skies. Confidence grew, not arrogance, but a measured understanding of the Thunderbolt's strengths. Pilots were no longer frustrated, they were strategic. The lessons of that day would resonate across the European theater. High-altitude diving attacks, careful energy management, and leveraging durability over maneuverability became the standard. The P-47 was no longer a clumsy giant. It was a juggernaut, capable of plowing through enemy formations and surviving where other planes would have been shredded. The groundwork had been laid for the coming months of air superiority. The pilots now understood that skill alone could not win the day. It was innovation, adaptation, and respect for their aircraft's unique strengths that would change the course of air combat over Europe. The following week brought more missions, each one a chance to refine the new tactics that had saved lives and turned the Thunderbolt into a formidable weapon. Pilots woke before dawn, the cold European air biting through flight jackets, engines, roaring on the tarmac as mechanics performed last-minute checks. Every detail mattered. Ammunition belts properly aligned, fuel levels verified, radios tested, and the canopy locks double-checked. The men knew that a small oversight could mean disaster at 20,000 feet. As the 56th Fighter Group climbed into formation, the horizon revealed distant specks, Luftwaffe fighters moving swiftly across the patchwork countryside. The first instinct of any pilot was to chase, to engage in the familiar dogfighting patterns drilled into them during training. But this time, experience guided them differently. P-47s stayed high, maintaining energy, and prepared for controlled dives that would maximize speed and firepower. The moment of contact was electrifying. German fighters spread into their usual attack formations, confident in their agility. The Americans waited, patient, until the enemy was within range. Then, with a sudden drop of altitude, the Thunderbolts plowed into the formation, guns blazing. Tracers streaked across the sky as 50 caliber rounds tore through fuselages and wings. Enemy pilots were caught off guard, unable to respond effectively to the sheer firepower and speed of the attack. Each dive was calculated. Pilots had learned to fire in short, controlled bursts to avoid overheating guns while ensuring maximum damage. After the initial strike, the P-47s would use their heavy airframes to climb rapidly, regaining altitude before the enemy could counterattack. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. Luftwaffe pilots hesitated, aware that a single mistake could be fatal. Amidst the chaos, American wingmen communicated through radios, calling out enemy positions, fuel status, and firing windows. The teamwork was seamless, honed by countless hours of training and the shared understanding that each pilot's survival depended on the others. Smoke trails, flaming aircraft, and spinning wreckage filled the sky, yet the Thunderbolts remained in control. It was during one of these engagements that Lieutenant James Jim Hartman, a young P-47 pilot, found himself diving through a cluster of Focke-Wulfs. He had trained for this moment countless times, but nothing prepared him for the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he unleashed a torrent of 50 caliber bullets. Enemy planes disintegrated before him, and he felt a mix of awe and disbelief at the destruction wrought by his aircraft. The success of these tactics spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force. Pilots began sharing their experiences during debriefings, detailing the precise angles, altitudes, and speeds that worked best against German fighters. Commanders adapted mission plans, sending P-47s on high-altitude escort duties and strike missions that leveraged their strengths to maximum effect. And here's a quick question for you, the viewers. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to fly in a P-47 during these missions? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more WW2 stories like this. By the end of the week, the results were clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once considered too heavy for dogfights, had become a juggernaut of the skies. Its pilots had discovered a way to turn what seemed like a disadvantage into a decisive advantage, reshaping air combat tactics and setting the stage for the crushing of enemy formations in the weeks to come. By late April 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had begun to master their new approach. High above the European countryside, the P-47 Thunderbolts soared, seemingly slow in comparison to their more nimble German counterparts. But that perception was deceptive. Pilots had learned that speed, firepower, and altitude could compensate for maneuverability, and that diving from above provided a lethal advantage. The morning mission started with the familiar briefing: weather reports, enemy intelligence, and squadron assignments. Lieutenant Hartman and his wingman, Lieutenant Charles Chuck Benson, listened intently. Their orders were simple but daring: escort a formation of B-17 bombers deep into Germany and engage any Luftwaffe fighters encountered along the route. The bomber crews were counting on them, and failure was not an option. As the squadron approached the Dutch coast, the first signs of enemy activity appeared. A small group of Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbing to intercept. The instinct to turn and engage was strong, but years of hard lessons guided the P-47 pilots differently. They maintained altitude, staying high above the enemy, and prepared to dive with precision. The Thunderbolts were heavy, yes, but that weight was an asset, allowing them to punch through formations with devastating kinetic energy. The dive began. Engines roared as the aircraft plummeted, gaining speed, guns spitting bullets that carved through the sky and the enemy's fragile planes. Messerschmitts tried to turn with the Thunderbolts, only to find themselves outmatched in a straight-line assault. The boom and zoom tactic worked flawlessly. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. Every mission reinforced a critical lesson. The P-47's durability allowed pilots to push the aircraft to extremes that would have been suicidal in lighter fighters. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns tore through wings, fuselages, and rudders alike. Even when hit, the Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would down a Spitfire in seconds. Pilots felt confident not just in their skills, but in the very frame of their aircraft. Below, the countryside blurred as aerial combat raged. Tracers arced through clouds, and bursts of black smoke marked the destruction of enemy planes. Squadron leaders coordinated their attacks, guiding wingmen to targets and calling out evasive maneuvers. The precision of the team and the effectiveness of their aircraft created a terrifyingly efficient machine of war in the skies. And here's a moment to engage with you, our viewers. Can you imagine being in the cockpit during these dives, with bullets and flak all around? Comment your thoughts, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more incredible WW2 stories like this. By mid-mission, the results were evident. Enemy formations were disrupted, bombers remained largely unscathed, and the Thunderbolts had asserted dominance over the skies. Word of these tactics spread quickly throughout the 8th Air Force. Pilots who had once doubted the P-47 now praised its raw power and reliability. The plane that had seemed cumbersome and unwieldy was now the instrument of strategic air superiority. As the squadron returned to base, pilots reflected on their journey from near disaster to dominance. They had learned that understanding their aircraft and adapting tactics to its strengths, not trying to fit it into the mold of other fighters, was the key to success. The P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed from a heavy, underappreciated fighter into a legend of the European theater. The success of the Thunderbolts in early missions began to reshape the tactics of the 8th Air Force as a whole. Commanders recognized that the P-47's raw power, combined with disciplined pilots, offered a unique opportunity to dominate the skies over Europe. Briefings grew longer, more detailed, focusing not just on routes and enemy positions, but on how to exploit the aircraft's strengths to the fullest. Pilots spent hours in the air during training exercises, practicing dives, climb patterns, and high-speed attacks. They learned to judge angles of approach with precision, to maximize the effectiveness of their 50 caliber machine guns while minimizing exposure to return fire. Every pilot understood that the Thunderbolt was not a nimble dogfighter, but a juggernaut of firepower and durability. As April 30th dawned, the 56th Fighter Group prepared for one of their most daring missions yet, escorting a fleet of B-17 bombers on a deep strike into northern Germany. Intelligence suggested the presence of multiple Luftwaffe squadrons along the route. The air was tense with anticipation. Mechanics made last-minute adjustments to the Thunderbolts, checking engines, armaments, and fuel lines. Pilots exchanged determined looks, knowing the success of the mission, and perhaps the survival of many bomber crews, depended on them. Once airborne, the Thunderbolts ascended to altitude, scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouettes of German fighters. As expected, enemy aircraft appeared, diving into attack positions. The instinctive reaction for any fighter pilot might have been to engage in tight-turning fights. But the lessons learned from previous encounters were clear. The P-47s remained high, conserving energy, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The first dive was breathtaking. Pilots plummeted toward the enemy at staggering speeds, guns blazing. Tracers arced through the sky, striking fuselages and wings with devastating precision. German pilots scrambled, trying to evade the onslaught, but the P-47's combination of speed, firepower, and tactical positioning left them little room for escape. The boom and zoom technique allowed the Thunderbolts to strike hard, then climb back to safety before any counterattack could be mounted. Squadron leaders coordinated their attacks with flawless timing. Every dive, every burst of gunfire, was calculated to maximize damage and minimize risk. The result was chaos for the Luftwaffe and security for the bomber crews below. Enemy formations were shredded in minutes, leaving survivors to retreat and regroup. The Thunderbolts' dominance in the skies was undeniable. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. German pilots realized that the once cumbersome P-47 could now strike with unmatched ferocity. Meanwhile, American pilots gained confidence, their skills and knowledge of the aircraft combining to create a near-unstoppable force. Trust in their machines, and in each other, grew with every successful sortie. By the time the squadron returned to base, the mission's results were clear. Multiple enemy aircraft destroyed, bombers delivered safely, and a new standard of aerial combat established. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once underestimated, had become the ultimate instrument of aerial dominance over Europe. The pilots had learned that understanding the strengths of their aircraft and adapting tactics to leverage them was the key to crushing enemy formations in minutes. The victories of April and May 1943 did more than just boost morale. They began to shift the entire strategy of air combat over Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once seen as a lumbering brute, had proven its worth as a devastating weapon in the right hands. Commanders now realized that the aircraft's heavy armor, immense firepower, and high-speed diving capability could not only protect bombers, but also dismantle enemy formations with surgical precision. Missions became more ambitious. Pilots trained relentlessly in simulated dives and coordinated attacks, perfecting the boom and zoom technique. They learned to anticipate the enemy's movements, using altitude, speed, and timing to strike where the Luftwaffe was most vulnerable. No longer were engagements about matching turn for turn. They were about hitting hard, striking fast, and then climbing away before the enemy could respond. Lieutenant Hartmann, now a seasoned pilot, reflected on how far they had come. The Thunderbolt's 2,000-horsepower engine roared as he led a flight of 4 aircraft over the rolling fields of northern France. The morning sun glinted off the metal fuselages, highlighting the aircraft's sheer size and power. Each plane carried a full load of ammunition, ready to unleash destruction on any enemy formations they encountered. As the squadron approached a German air patrol near the Ardennes, the familiar tension gripped every pilot. Smoke rose from distant flak batteries, and the hum of engines filled the sky. Then, like a predator sensing prey, the P-47s dove. Their immense weight and momentum made them almost unstoppable in a high-speed attack. Tracers streaked toward enemy aircraft, tearing wings and fuselages apart. The Luftwaffe pilots, once confident in their agility, were caught off guard by the sheer force of the assault. Ground observers would later report seeing a chain reaction. One enemy plane down, others scattering in panic, their formations completely disrupted. The boom and zoom tactic not only destroyed aircraft, but also shattered morale. German pilots realized that their traditional aerial strategies were ineffective against this new breed of American fighter. Between engagements, pilots communicated constantly via radio, calling out targets, warning of flak positions, and coordinating dive angles. The teamwork was flawless, born from training, trust, and countless hours spent in formation. Each dive was carefully calculated, every climb and maneuver designed to maintain speed and position. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a plane. It was an extension of the pilot's skill, a machine that amplified their ability to dominate the skies. By the time the squadron returned to base, the results were unmistakable. Multiple enemy aircraft destroyed, bomber formations intact, and pilots eager for the next sortie. The P-47 Thunderbolt had cemented its reputation as a juggernaut of the skies. Its pilots had learned to exploit its strengths fully, turning what once seemed like a liability into an unparalleled advantage in aerial combat. The lessons of these missions spread quickly. Other squadrons adopted similar tactics, and the Luftwaffe found itself facing an enemy that could strike with devastating speed and power. What began as trial and error had evolved into a blueprint for dominance, ensuring that the P-47 and its pilots would leave an indelible mark on the air war over Europe. By early June 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolts were no longer just learning to survive. They were mastering the skies over occupied Europe. The lessons from earlier missions had become standard operating procedures, and the pilots' confidence had grown with each successful sortie. These Thunderbolts, heavy and seemingly unwieldy, had become precision tools of destruction when flown with strategy and discipline. The morning sun rose over the French countryside as Lieutenant Hartmann led his squadron on another bomber escort mission. The B-17s, laden with bombs for strategic strikes deep inside enemy territory, depended entirely on the fighter escort to fend off Luftwaffe interceptors. Every pilot understood the stakes. Failure meant not just personal danger, but the possible loss of dozens of bomber crews. As the squadron climbed to altitude, the pilots surveyed the horizon. Small specks in the distance revealed German fighters attempting to climb into interception positions. Instinct and experience guided the Thunderbolts to stay above the enemy, using their superior altitude as leverage. The dive would be devastating, and timing was everything. When the enemy came into range, the P-47s initiated their dive. Engines screamed as the aircraft plummeted at incredible speeds, guns blazing. Tracers streaked across the sky, slicing through enemy planes with terrifying precision. One by one, German fighters were hit, wings torn apart, fuselages smoking, pilots struggling to maintain control. The boom and zoom tactic proved unstoppable. Squadron communication was critical. Pilots called out enemy positions, alerting wingmen to threats and coordinating angles of attack. Each maneuver was calculated, designed to maintain energy, speed, and positioning. The P-47's weight, once considered a disadvantage, now became a lethal asset, allowing pilots to strike hard and recover quickly for another pass. Amidst the chaos, Hartmann noticed a Bf-109 attempting to dive on a bomber from the rear. Without hesitation, he throttled up and dived straight through the enemy formation, guns tearing through the 109's fuselage. The bomber below remained unharmed, and Hartmann climbed back to regroup with his squadron. These split-second decisions, born from training and experience, were what made the P-47 such an effective weapon. After the engagement, pilots reflected on how far they had come. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a heavy fighter. It was a strategic instrument capable of altering the outcome of aerial engagements. Its durability allowed pilots to press attacks without fear of catastrophic failure, and its firepower made it the scourge of enemy formations. And for our viewers watching, where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible WW2 stories like this. By the time the squadron returned to base, enemy losses were significant, and bomber crews reported 0 casualties. The P-47 had proven beyond doubt that with the right tactics, it could dominate the airspace, crushing squadrons in minutes and reshaping the way air combat was conducted. Commanders began to adapt, sending more P-47s on critical missions, and enemy pilots grew increasingly wary. The Thunderbolt's reputation spread, instilling fear in the Luftwaffe while emboldening the Americans. Each mission reinforced the same truth. Understanding and exploiting the strengths of the P-47 made the difference between survival and annihilation. By mid-June 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt pilots had begun to understand the true power of their aircraft. What had once seemed a cumbersome, underpowered fighter was now a precision instrument of war in the hands of skilled aviators. The European skies, once dominated by the nimble Luftwaffe fighters, were slowly being reshaped by these heavy, powerful planes. On a clear morning over northern France, Lieutenant Hartmann led a formation of 8 P-47s on an escort mission for a fleet of B-17 bombers. The sun glinted off the plane's metal skins as they climbed to altitude, scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft. Reports had indicated that a squadron of Bf-109s had been spotted near the intended flight path. Every pilot in the formation knew the importance of maintaining discipline, altitude, and positioning. One misstep could result in disaster, not just for the fighter pilots, but for the bombers they were sworn to protect. As the Thunderbolts approached the enemy, the German fighters attempted to engage from a higher altitude. The Americans held steady, conserving energy and preparing for the inevitable dive. The moment was tense. Even experienced pilots felt the adrenaline surge as they waited for the perfect opportunity. Then, with a coordinated signal, the squadron began their dive. engines screaming and guns spitting a storm of 50 caliber fire. The German formations were caught completely off guard. The P-47s plowed through the Luftwaffe lines with devastating effect. Wings were shredded, fuselages ignited, and pilots spun out of control. The boom and zoom tactic proved once again that altitude and speed, combined with overwhelming firepower, could decisively end engagements in minutes. Throughout the fight, communication was vital. Pilots called out enemy positions, alerting wingmen to incoming threats and coordinating angles of attack. The heavy Thunderbolts, previously thought too slow to turn in combat, now used their weight as an advantage, smashing through formations with brutal efficiency. Amidst the chaos, Hartmann noticed a Messerschmitt attempting to dive on a bomber. Without hesitation, he throttled up and plowed straight through the formation, the guns ripping into the enemy aircraft. Flames and smoke marked the destruction, and the bomber below continued unscathed. The confidence of the pilots grew with every successful attack, their trust in the P-47 cemented. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. German pilots, once confident in their agility, hesitated and reevaluated their tactics. Meanwhile, the Americans discovered that mastery of their aircraft, not trying to mimic the enemy, was the key to success. The P-47's resilience allowed pilots to push their planes to the limit, surviving hits that would down lighter aircraft and returning home to fight again. By the time the squadron returned to base, enemy losses were staggering, and bomber formations had suffered minimal damage. The Thunderbolt had solidified its reputation as a juggernaut of the skies. Its pilots understood that through precise tactics, teamwork, and leveraging the strengths of their aircraft, they could crush squadrons in mere minutes, turning what had once been a liability into the ultimate advantage in aerial warfare. By late June 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolts had firmly established themselves as the backbone of American fighter operations over Europe. The lessons learned from earlier missions had become ingrained in every pilot's approach. Use altitude and speed to dictate engagements, rely on firepower rather than nimble turns, and maintain tight formation discipline. These principles had transformed a once underestimated aircraft into a feared instrument of aerial dominance. Lieutenant Hartmann and his squadron were briefed early on a crisp morning for a particularly dangerous mission, escorting B-17 bombers on a deep strike into industrial northern Germany. Intelligence reports indicated that multiple Luftwaffe squadrons were preparing to intercept the bombers. Every pilot understood the stakes. One mistake could mean catastrophe for the bombers, and potentially for themselves. As the Thunderbolts climbed to meet the incoming threat, the first German fighters were spotted on the horizon. The Bf-109s and FW-190s attempted to position themselves above the bombers, believing their superior maneuverability would give them the advantage. But the P-47 pilots had learned not to engage on the enemy's terms. Maintaining altitude, they prepared for the decisive dive that would unleash their aircraft's true potential. The moment arrived. The squadron throttled forward, plummeting toward the unsuspecting enemy. The roar of the engines combined with the staccato bursts of 50 caliber fire as tracers tore through the air. German aircraft were shredded in seconds, their formations collapsing under the relentless onslaught. Boom and zoom tactics allowed the P-47s to strike hard and recover, climbing back to altitude for another attack. Amidst the chaos, squadron communication was critical. Pilots called out enemy positions, coordinated angles of attack, and warned wingmen of threats. The P-47's heavy frames, previously seen as a disadvantage, now became assets. The momentum generated in each dive made the planes almost unstoppable, plowing through enemy formations and leaving destruction in their wake. Lieutenant Hartmann himself executed a daring maneuver. Spotting a fighter diving on a bomber, he angled his Thunderbolt and plowed directly through the enemy formation. The 50 caliber guns ripped into the fuselage of the attacking plane, sending it spiraling down in flames. The bomber below remained untouched, a testament to both skill and the Thunderbolt's resilience. By the end of the engagement, enemy losses were substantial. Squadron reports indicated dozens of destroyed aircraft, and bomber crews reported 0 casualties. The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was unmistakable. German pilots had come to respect and even fear the P-47s. What had once seemed a cumbersome and heavy fighter was now a symbol of unstoppable American air power. And for those watching this story unfold, where are you watching this video from? Comment below. If you enjoy these WWW2 aerial combat stories, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. The mission reinforced a vital lesson. Success in air combat depended not on trying to imitate the enemy, but on understanding and exploiting the unique advantages of one's own aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its speed, armor, and firepower, had become the ultimate enforcer in the skies. Each engagement not only protected the bombers, but also shattered enemy morale, paving the way for continued air superiority over Europe. By the time the squadron returned to base, the pilots were exhausted but triumphant. They had not only survived one of the most intense aerial battles in the campaign, but had also further solidified the tactics that would define P-47 operations for the rest of the war. The combination of strategic insight, discipline, and raw aircraft power had transformed the Thunderbolt into a legend. By July 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had earned a fearsome reputation across the European theater. Missions that once seemed perilous had become opportunities to assert dominance in the skies. American pilots, now seasoned and confident, knew exactly how to exploit their aircraft's strengths, and the Thunderbolt's combination of speed, firepower, and durability made them nearly unstoppable. Lieutenant Hartman reflected on the journey from their first tentative sorties to the brutal efficiency they now wielded. The boom and zoom tactics had evolved from trial and error into a precise science. The squadron's coordination, communication, and understanding of energy management in aerial combat allowed them to strike with devastating effect while minimizing risk. Each dive, each pass through enemy formations was calculated to maximize destruction and protect the bombers they were tasked to defend. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was undeniable. German pilots had once looked at the P-47 as a lumbering giant, easy to outmaneuver. Now, they approached with caution, aware that one miscalculated move could result in their aircraft being torn apart within minutes. The Thunderbolt had not only leveled the playing field, it had tilted it decisively in favor of the Americans. And for our viewers watching this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more WWW2 stories like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps us bringing history to life. By the time the squadron landed and shut down their engines, the results were clear. Enemy formations had been decimated, bomber crews had returned safely, and the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven itself as one of the most formidable fighters of the war. What had begun as a challenge to master an unwieldy aircraft had become a lesson in leveraging strength, strategy, and courage to crush enemy forces. The legend of the Thunderbolt would endure, remembered not just for its mechanical might, but for the pilots who understood it, trusted it, and used it to redefine air combat over Europe.